Let's talk supply chain. So welcome to the show, Jeff. How are you? Thanks for joining me today.
I'm doing great, Sarah. Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I'm so excited to have you here. Now, in our last episode, we heard all about GAINS, who you are, what you do, how you help your customers, and it was really insightful for me and really understanding the impact that you and your team and GAINS are making on the industry. And so today we're going to be talking about decision making.
Absolutely.
And that is so important for supply chain professionals, optimization, as we think about the future of the industry and what we want that to look like. So before we get started, why don't you tell everybody who you are, what you do, and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay. So at GAINS, I'm the Vice President of Solution Strategy.
Okay.
And so what that means is I wear two hats, if you will. Mm-hmm. One is helping to shape the overall future strategy and vision of the company and where we're heading on the longer term. Mm-hmm. And then I also head up our design business, our supply chain design business unit. So based on an acquisition that GAINS made in the spring, with a company called 3 Tenants Optimization, we now are squarely in the supply chain design arena.
Okay.
And that's kind of been between planning and design. So I've been at this a little over 35 years. It's been a combination of being out in industry in the beginning part of my career at GM and IBM. I've been in 5 different software companies back in the day, from i2 Technologies to LlamaSoft, and now here at GAINS and a few other smaller ones in between, part of the leadership teams there. And then I was the co-founder of a management consultancy that's based here in Atlanta called Chainalytics, where I head up the supply chain design and planning practice.
Well, and I love the design part. So I've got a lot of next generation talking about supply chain, coming into supply chain, and design is very, very important to them. They really like the creativity part that comes behind supply chain design. And I've been talking about that a lot recently because prior to that we were talking a lot about visibility. But now it seems to be more about the design, the planning, the orchestration, right? What do we need to know? What do we need to plan for? What do we need to design for? And it really brings out, and people don't, when they think about supply chain, they don't really think about the creativity aspect and what we can actually do and design. So for those that don't understand supply chain design, can you just give a little bit of an overview?
And I think part of it is the history of it. So classically, people have thought about supply chain design as strategic network design, and it's been all about infrastructure. So where do I put my capacity inside of my supply chain? My warehouse is my production, my strategic sourcing. But design is really also about the policies that govern and guide planning and execution. And so when we think about how do I flow product through my supply chain, what modes of transportation do I use, what are my inventory policies and targets, those are all governing policies that influence how we plan and then how we execute inside of them.
I love that.
So it's more of this ongoing continuous process. Yes, there's infrastructure and kind of capacity related decisions, but there's tactical operational flow and policy based decisions as well. It's kind of been caught in the middle. What do we want to call it? Planning? Do we want to call it design?
I like the design.
At GAINS we just really want to call it decisioning. And so
that's fair.
What are the decisions you want to make, and then where do they fit classically kind of in the architecture or the infrastructure of doing that.
And that's what we're going to be talking about today is decisioning, which is a new word for my vocabulary. So ongoing disruptions around the globe. Right? They've really showed us that as an industry, we're ill-equipped for volatility. We weren't really set up for agile, strategic, effective decision-making. Talk to us about that. Why is that?
I think part of it is if we look at the supply chain planning processes that have existed, and many of them have existed for the last 30 plus years. They were developed in an environment where things were relatively stable and they were relatively predictable. And supply chains were short, right? They weren't as global in nature. They weren't as interconnected. And now when we have this movement towards that, we've designed everything, going back to the design kind of word, right? We've thought about the number one driver in supply chain forever as being cost. Right? And minimizing cost.
Yes. Right? I used to get beat up as a forwarder on costs.
And so it's been, what's the level of service I want to provide against cost? But, the financial part of the organization, the CFOs are driving us to get the costs as low as we possibly can to operate. And in a really stable, highly predictable world, it's a great objective.
Right.
But when it's not stable, right, and there's a high level of volatility or uncertainty, then driving just to cost makes our supply chain super fragile, right, and easy to break. And so the whole process has kind of been designed around, I can predict, I can be on cadences, I can be predicting when I want to do my cycles of demand planning and S&OP. But the environment today doesn't really warrant that. We've got to be able to make decisions when they're needed, not on some kind of fixed cadence.
Well, and that's kind of the challenge, right? Decision making, we don't talk about this a lot, but decision making really is part of the challenge that we have in supply chain. Either we don't have enough information, we're not entirely sure what all the options are, and are we considering all of the options, right? You know, I talk a lot on the show about decision making being gut instinct, and it has been a gut instinct for a very, very long time. And it's really common in supply chain, among supply chain professionals, especially been in this industry for a long time, and you've seen it all, or almost everything, right? Nobody could have planned the pandemic. So what are some of the inherent risks in decision making that maybe supply chain professionals, maybe they're thinking about, maybe they're not thinking about, and what should they be thinking about when they're thinking about the decisions that they have to make on a day-to-day basis and the impact of those decisions? Because it's heavy.
Yeah, I think it's partly this notion that because it's become more and more complicated. So any way we look at it, complexities of supply chains have grown tremendously, right? When we try to understand, like for a human being to make a decision, intuitively happens because we simplify things. Right? So we make them as simple as possible. We look for patterns in how we made decisions in the past, and we assume that our past kind of actions and performance hold true today. So if we kind of couple it back to where we were before, this notion of we're not in a stable, predictable environment, but yet I'm making my decisions as if I were.
Fair enough.
And so I get myself, quote unquote, into trouble in that environment. I'm trying to operate with my gut based on past experiences. I'm simplifying things because it's too complicated to get my hand around or my head around what it means to do all of this. And then what happens is I respond and react. Right? So instead of trying to understand all this complexity and uncertainty up front in my decision-making process, I've decided it's too hard, so I'll push that away and I'll respond at the end. Right? And I'll keep on reacting to what's happening to me. And we think at GAINS, we'll talk more about it, we think at GAINS you need to flip that script and talk about how to do more of it up front.
Yeah, and I think it's human nature too, right? There's a bit of human instinct in there. And that's kind of what we do, right? But we also need the tools.
We need the tools.
We need the tips and the tricks to help us.
And we don't have unlimited time, and we don't have unlimited cost.
And we're thinking about so many things. Like how many decisions does a supply chain professional have to make on a daily basis? It's got to be in the tens of hundreds, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, and for an organization, it's in the thousands if you think about what's going on. Yeah, it was really interesting. As part of some research that I did recently before our user conference, thinking about how many decisions you make on a daily basis on the food you eat.
I know, right? It's all I think about.
And the research out there is like, you're making over 200 decisions a day. Just on what food you're going to put in your body. So imagine what someone's doing associated with supply chain decisioning.
Wow, that's overwhelming.
It's overwhelming.
So talk to us about what that decision making in supply chain looks like at the moment. What's the process, the focus, the timings of typical supply chain decisions? And remember, we're making a lot of decisions on a daily basis.
I mean, decisioning today inside of supply chains, and it is this evolution over the last 30 years, and I wouldn't say it's evolved, it's been pretty static. It's been this time bucket oriented. So we think about things in the classical strategic, tactical, operational timeframes. Right? We think about processes around source, make, deliver. And then we've created these processes of S&OP. And and we've created demand planning and manufacturing planning.
So many acronyms.
So many acronyms.
Just in
so many
JIT, JIC.
And so many processes, and the focus, if you think about people talk in terms of the processes, but we really should be talking in terms of the decisions that we're making.
Okay.
And so everything is in this, what I mentioned before, it's a cyclical environment. We're not doing a great job of passing information and data from one process to the other. The policies and decisions that we may make in a strategic time frame don't necessarily flow all the way through.
Okay, fair.
We're doing things almost completely deterministically. So there's no notion of variability and uncertainty in our decision making, right? This is the cost that I'm expecting. These are my lead times. These are my yields, and they're point numbers, right? And so when I put that all together, and then I do very limited scenario and sensitivity analysis today, because it's too complex, it's too burdensome to think through all the possible combinations.
And we might not even know them all.
And we may not know them all, right? And we don't necessarily have the time, because we haven't set up the infrastructures and systems to support all that. And then in addition, we have been focused really on cost. Is the number one driver of our decision making, and then service, and that's just no longer efficient to do that anymore, or acceptable.
So talk to us about why it's not working, or like it's not really working from what I'm gathering from you.
Yeah, so, I mean, it's working, but not as good as it needs to be. So I would say that we've been in this environment of stagnation. So a couple of examples. You think about S&OP as one example, as a process. Right? I can remember presenting at an IBF, Institute of Business Forecasting, conference 10 years ago. And we talked about...
I'm sure a lot has changed.
Well, unfortunately, it hasn't. That's part of the problem, is that the actual results are not materializing. We talked about how companies are stuck in like this maturity of supply chain and operations planning at this level 3 out of 5. Right? And they can't get beyond level 3. That was 10 years ago. Everything today says the exact same thing. Companies are still stuck, and they can't get beyond level 3.
We're still at level 3?
We're still at level 3 in
10
general.
10 years later.
10 years later.
All right.
Right? So we're not moving forward there. When we think about things like forecast accuracy, right, that's driving, there's an overemphasis on that, but just using that as an example. At the SKU level, so we think about forecasting, like let's say in a distribution environment, what's my demand going to be for each SKU at a stocking location?
Right.
We haven't improved accuracy there. We're stagnant there. And so inventory turns performance, right? So GAINS is all about helping companies, that have inventory, challenges, and inventory matters to them, to do a better job with them.
Right.
And we've done a really good job of moving the needle for our customers that were before not on GAINS, and then they come on GAINS, but then we plateau. Right? And so overall as an industry, we're not doing better on inventory turn performance. In fact, we're doing worse. And even without you could put the pandemic in there, but even if you go back before the pandemic to today, most of the industries that GAINS focuses on at a high level, their turns are worse than they were before.
Wow.
So things are not looking like we're moving the needle in the right direction with all this great planning and technology, right, that's associated with it.
And how do we get there? And that's what we're talking
that's what
about
we're trying to
today,
talk about, right?
So you say that we're living in is it a VUCA world?
Well, that's how I think that's how it's pronounced.
It's VUCA for the audience out there. What does that mean? Talk us through that, and what does that mean also to supply chain?
Yeah, so VUCA is a phrase that got generated in the late 80s. It was
it's another acronym?
It's an acronym. It was military in nature to start with, but it's not anything new. So it's volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity.
Okay, I think I have heard of that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So we are and have been living in this VUCA environment for a significant amount of time, and I think the pandemic, in and of itself, and I don't want to overspeak the pandemic, but it's shown the light on the fact that volatility. So the increased amount of events that are happening around the world, right, and those are not decreasing. There was a recent study that I tapped into from Resolink. You may have heard of them, right? That they're monitoring supply chain disruption events around the world. Every one of the categories, with the exception of one, has been increasing year over year.
Wow.
Right.
From a risk standpoint.
Well, from a disruption perspective. Yeah, I would call it, and the risk associated with it. Yeah, absolutely. And so factory fires are the number one. disruptive event, which surprised me. I don't know why that's the case, but
yeah, because they don't really talk about it.
They don't talk about it, but it's the #1 disruptive event. But then the next bulk, which I found really fascinating, is really all around managerial changes, mergers and acquisitions.
Wow.
Right, they're not the typical like port disruptions, weather events,
like we thought.
That we think, and they're there. And they definitely have an impact, but just think about when you merge two companies together, how disruptive that is, what you have to do with new management, new systems, et cetera. And so supply chains are not just associated with the external physical environment of disruptions, there's internal disruptions that are impacting them as well.
Yeah.
But uncertainty is growing. Right, so that's kind of the volatility aspect of it. There's uncertainty that's actually growing. If you look at things like, let's just use a logistics example of ocean schedules, right? Ocean schedules pre and post pandemic, because they got really bad during the pandemic, were like in the 80% reliability.
Okay, wow.
So 20% of the time, 20% of the time, you're actually like not going to be on time. But you're planning your environment
like you are.
Like you are.
Yes.
And then when it's not, what do? You react and respond.
Yeah.
And it shouldn't be a surprise. Like we know that this exists.
Yeah.
And so why are we not taking it into account up front, right? And then the last item was just complexity. So there was a recent study that was done by Gartner where they went out and surveyed a group of their customers, and all these different areas that you would associate with complexity. So, are you going to grow the number of facilities, locations, customers, channels, products? Right.
So many things.
All of them going up. Nothing's going down. So we're just adding more and more complexity into it. So more disruptions, more uncertainty, more complexity in our supply chain, and we're still using old approaches and techniques to solve them.
Yeah. I mean, some people, I think I saw a study that said 65% of supply chain professionals are still using Excel.
Yeah. Well, it's the #1 planning tool on the planet.
Right.
Right. And which is wild. And it's not, what's interesting to me, Sarah, as I've been going through my career, is like you would always think that the larger companies, right, your Fortune 100s, right, are on the best and most sophisticated technology.
Yeah.
And it surprises you when they're not.
Yeah.
When they're still using Excel and they're still using, that in complement to their systems.
Well, and to put that into perspective too, right? When you're using Excel, you're always uploading and downloading and uploading and downloading information. And that kind of just shows you what the life in a supply chain professional's life using Excel to plan and how they're moving that data around can look like.
Well, right. And just even think about the maintainability of that. Like so many of these spreadsheets are tied to the individual that created them.
And did you make another copy and then add something to it? And how many versions do we have?
How many versions, and can you control it? And when that individual leaves, like who picks up the pieces to understand what's actually there?
That's very, very true, because it is tied to them, right?
Right, right.
So with all the volatility and complexity, right, conversations around risk and resilience are only going to increase in importance, like you talked about.
Right.
We need to know what we need to look out for and what that #1, I mean, the fires that you were just talking about, that's not even something that I would have thought was really the high item that we need to think about. And actually, you also say that the age of building supply chains around cost has to be over, which is what we've talked about as well. And so let's...
cost only.
Cost only.
Yeah, it's still got to be a consideration.
Yeah.
Right, but just based on cost or financial performance.
Right, because we also can't move through life like that. We need more collaboration in the industry.
Sure.
Right, collaboration is the future of business. If we are hammering each other just on cost alone, we're not going to get anywhere.
Right.
Individually or together. Right?
Yep.
So why is it that we need to also be considering that resiliency? And what does resiliency kind of mean to you? Because we talk about it, it's a bit of a buzzword, right? And how are organizations sort of balancing the varied considerations and objectives to change their focus? How do we get away from the cost only? How do we consider the resilience in how we move forward? And what do we need to think about?
That's a lot of questions.
I know. I figured you could tie it all in.
No, that's good. So let's start, I guess, with definition, right? And there's my perspective is there's a confusion between resiliency and agility.
Okay,
right?
that's fair.
So
because we use them
interchangeably, right?
Yeah.
And I'm going to ascribe to the definition of agility is the supply chain's ability to adapt and change based on the demand.
Okay.
Right. So based on your customer, changes in your customer's demand, requirements, products that you're launching in the marketplace, how agile can I adapt to fulfilling demand?
Right. Okay.
Resiliency is the ability of the supply chain to get back to the expected level of performance when it's disrupted.
Okay.
Right. So when I'm disrupted, we'll use the factory fire as an example, or ports or whatever it may be. I lose a piece of my network. And if I don't have the ability to respond to get back to the level of my performance, I'm not resilient.
Well,
right?
and I want to use another example of cybersecurity as well.
Yeah.
Right? If you get hacked,
Right.
What's the response time? How long is it going to take you to get back
that's a great
online
example. Right.
so that you can start
back to the performance that's expected, right? And so, I think what we as supply chain professionals, right? So we know that resiliency was always important, but we really learned the hard lesson during the pandemic.
Yeah. How do we get back online?
How do we get
back on track?
Right.
How do we bring disruption into our supply chain design and planning?
Well, that's right. And doing it up front as opposed to, there's been a lot of responsiveness planning. There's what do I do with my war rooms when things happen? But how do I incorporate
crisis management rooms?
Crisis
too.
management
I've heard
rooms,
crisis
war
management.
rooms.
I'm like, we need to do a supply chain TV show about
crisis management.
Or war rooms.
Or war rooms. But it's more about what you can do up front. So what did we learn why resiliency is important? If we have built our supply chains on minimizing cost, right, we are not allowed to have redundancy. Right, in that world.
We're not allowed. Smaller margins, you've got slim margins.
We can't have alternative suppliers because those cost money. So this notion of having a resilient supply chain that can actually bounce back when it's hit with whatever the disruptions are that are associated with it is like an insurance policy.
That's so true.
We all take out insurance policies.
Yeah.
Why? Well, because we've made the decision that if my house got burned down or if I got into an auto accident, I need to be protected to bring myself back.
Right.
And so these strategies around resiliency are exactly the same thing. If companies were better prepared before the pandemic hit, right, to actually say, I may lose my supply. Right. I may have port congestion that's through the roof, right?
Yeah.
I've planned for that contingency, and there's a variety of different strategies to do that. I would not have lost business along the way.
Time.
Right.
People.
So time, business, customers. People.
Right.
Right.
Because when lines go down.
Yep.
Right. You have to send them home.
You got to send them home.
There's no
unless there's something else that they're doing, right, that you've planned for. So this notion of you asked the question, how well are companies doing balancing it off? We don't think companies are doing a good job at all.
Okay.
We actually think that that's part of what we need to set out to do is create this environment that you can actually trade off financial considerations with service considerations, with agility, with resiliency, and then let's not forget sustainability.
Right.
Because now sustainability has also come in the forefront of supply chain decision makers.
Yeah.
So how do I incorporate all of those things in one overarching framework to help me make better decisions?
Yeah.
And the end game is not just financial performance for tomorrow, but it's more of the longer term, like overall performance of the company.
So talk to us about the responsive execution. How are they moving away from the resilience that we're talking about to a responsive execution to meet the goals that they have using VUCA? Because I think what you're really talking to your customers about and really stressing is that it's kind of here to stay.
Yep.
You need to be resilient.
Right.
But really, you need to have a response plan.
Well, it's not, so I think we say it a little bit differently. It's not that you need to have a response plan. I think the focus today is very much on respond and react. Right.
We don't want them reacting anymore.
Right.
We want them to be proactive.
Well, we want them to be proactive, but we also want them to react when it makes sense to react.
Okay.
Right.
Fair.
So not overreacting. Right. And so today's environment, we believe in the supply chain planning world. There's a framework from Gartner that we like a lot. It's called CORE.
Okay.
Right, and so it's configure, optimize.
Here's
Another
acronym.
acronym that we throw out there if you didn't know about it, right? So
we need a dictionary. Oh wait, I have one.
we're famous for all these acronyms, right? But sometimes they get it across, and I like them. So configure, optimize, right? Respond, and then execution.
Okay.
And it's kind of execution visibility. So the premise that we have is that so much of today's decisioning is because we're not taking uncertainty into account up front, because we're providing point solutions of answers, so single numbers, when something doesn't perform to that one single number, we believe we need to react, and we believe we need to respond.
Yeah.
Right? And so there's just this over concentration and emphasis on building out control towers, building out command centers. Let's do a better job of monitoring the environment that we're operating in, because we didn't take this variability and uncertainty in account up front in our planning, and it's really going to happen. And so let's make sure when it really happens to us, we have everything at our disposal to understand how to react.
Yeah.
But
and so we're not overreacting.
Right, not overreact, but I can't replan because my planning cycle is on a monthly cadence. Right? So I have to wait for my traditional processes to kick in. So in the meantime, let's firefight, let's respond, let's react at the bottom. And so we're trying to flip the script to say it's not about doing that after the fact, right? Think about like a manufacturing process where you build quality in, you build it in up front and early as you can. We're going to take that same kind of concept and put more of this in the configure and optimize. So configure design, optimize traditional planning, and incorporate it up there so we can know within ranges of performance, this is acceptable. I'm not out of control, so I don't need to do anything. Today, I'm always out of control because I expect my financial number to be X, and I expect my lead time to be Y.
And I think about the mental health aspect of it.
Yeah.
Supply chain professionals, right? They're dealing with a lot on a daily basis. We've talked about the number of decisions that they have to make on a daily basis as well. And I can just imagine when you are so focused on that one number and not having that resiliency, that flexibility, how overwhelming that can be for the leadership. And then that's just going to trickle down, which makes people
That's a really good point.
overreact in the moment. Because we also need to
the higher pressure of that performance to do in the moment. Like if I don't have to react in the executional, well, let's say it this way, my decisions in the executional time frame are really where the rubber hits the road, and if I do something wrong there, I can see it. But if I can incorporate in this thinking further upstream in my decision making, then it's less of an issue for that person that has to make the execution decision. Because they know they're operating within a tolerance range that doesn't require me, hey, if I make this move, is that going to really be a good or bad move?
Well, I'm going to lose my job, or
I'm going to lose my job.
Like that's the harsh reality. And we're also looking at burnout. You don't want burnout. And so how are we giving our supply chain teams the tools, the necessary tools, the response plans, the execution plan, the designing up front that really helps them do their job in the way that needs to happen without burnout, without the mental health crisis that we're all facing as well. So that's kind of one of the impacts that this can all make in the industry and on the daily lives of supply chain professionals. What other impacts do you see this making in the industry as a whole to tackle some of the challenges that we've really been talking about today?
Well, I think at the end of the day, and it's going to sound odd that I'm going to go back to the financial performance, But I think at the end of the day,
not cost only.
Not cost only. But when I think about financial performance and viability and sustainability of companies, I think that the ability to actually manage this uncertainty up front without this overreaction. This overreaction is actually costing us more money.
More time, more energy, more money,
people, resources,
burnout.
And so we believe that the having to respond after the fact as opposed to respond early on is going to have an influence on all these categories of improving performance.
So think about decisioning and the decision making and how GAINS supports their clients in being able to really maximize the impact of that decisioning. If I'm in the audience, what kind of company or do I need to look like to work with you where this particular solution makes sense to me?
Yeah, I mean, it could be almost any company. I mean, there's not anybody that's like not being impacted by this, but in general, it's organizations where at the heart and soul, inventory is super important to the success of their business, and they are operating in multiple locations. So people that have or companies that have a single plant and a single distribution center, that's not really typically our customer.
Right.
So proliferation of product portfolios, multiple locations, extended supply chains. Those are the areas where there's value in this. And I think the more that companies are on their growth, what we've seen in a lot of companies that start with us and they're really smallish, right? They're the $200-300 million companies that then want to get on that path early on so that when they grow up to be the 1 billion plus companies, this is already embedded as part of their DNA. Right. And so I don't think there's any wrong time to start. But if things are super simple, relatively speaking, this is not your play.
Right.
Right. So the greater your current degree of complexity is, the better you're suited to kind of do this stuff with us.
Well, they're kind of partnering with you on the competitive advantage and
they
on
are.
the growth trajectory.
They are. No, that's a great point.
Of what they are doing and how they're going to get there.
Right. And this is, I mean, we're very clear about it. This is the vision and strategy of where we think we know we need to take GAINS. And need to support the industry, but we're on the beginning of our journey as well. But the first part of this is admitting that you have a problem. Right.
Yeah. So, that's the hardest part. When we talk about challenges, that could be the number one.
It could be the number one thing. It's admitting that you have a problem, right? It's kind of the 7-step processes. And so while we continue to give value to our current customers and they're taking advantage of what they have, we'd be remiss to not identify everything we've talked about so far needs a different approach. It needs a different solution. And so we're starting to get our current customer base interested in going on this journey with us. And we're starting to talk about it in the beginning, but it starts with these talks, right, of acknowledging that we can't keep on doing things the way we're doing it, and we need some change.
And that decision making is so important, but you need the support. You need everything to be able to make those decisions and not overreact and not have your teams feel overwhelmed. I'm going to share some stats that I have.
Sure.
According to a McKinsey survey of more than 1,200 global business leaders, inefficient decision making costs a typical Fortune 500 company 530,000 days of managers' time each year.
Crazy.
And that's the equivalent to about 250 million in annual wages. So, if you do not think that decision making or decisioning is something that you need to work on, that survey kind of says a different story, doesn't it?
It does.
All right.
It does.
So what's one final word, one final piece of advice that you would have for our audience about decision making?
Yeah, I guess the final word that I would actually have is, hopefully you all agree that what we've been using in the past is really not appropriate for the future. And it's going to take truly a community. It's not going to just be GAINS, right, that's going to make this happen. It's a way of thinking in supply chain. That we've got to adopt this understanding that variability, uncertainty, complexity, and addressing it is needed. And it's not let's get rid of respond and react, but let's do it so that we're minimizing it, right, at the end of the day.
Do it better for everybody.
Do it better for everybody. And realize that we still want to, part of what we didn't talk about just really, really quick is we're still all about minimizing variability, right? So it's not that this is
but can we actually do that? I mean, let's be real.
I think we can reduce it.
Okay.
Right. So there are things that we can do to reduce the variability that's happening to us. There are things that we can do to better manage the uncertainty. So there's going to be a level that's going to be, I can't get better than that. But many companies are operating up here.
Right. And how do we get there? If you're not there, you need to get there.
You need to get there.
And you need to partner with the right people to do that.
Yeah.
Right.
And we think we're one of those people.
Well, tell everybody then how they can find out more about you.
Yeah, I mean, just, reach out to us on our website. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn. Awesome. And let's open up a dialogue and conversation about this.
Yeah, and the website is gainsystems.com, GAIN systems.com. operationalizing.com if you want more information. Jeff, thank you so much for joining me on the white couch today.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure. Appreciate it.